All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. And we're gonna do another philosophy episode today. Got Tim Keefe is back here, and so is Shane Kennedy, and we're gonna talk about Nietzsche's essay, Heidegger's essay on Nietzsche's "Where God is Dead," but we
No,
don't
no,
have
no, no,
much
no.
time as usual, so we're just gonna go through phenomenology and theology today, and we're gonna save that other one for another day. So we're gonna go through Heidegger's essay, Phenomenology and Theology today, and why don't you guys just introduce yourselves there to those people who don't know you, and then we can go from there.
Okay. Shane, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, just to keep it short and sweet, I'm just an interested party who spent some time reviewing and reading this stuff on my own time, so to speak, and just interested in learning more. I think that's the most of the relevant points for today's purposes.
Awesome.
Yes. Shane is also a repeat offender, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
I talked to him like this is the third time in the past 6 days, I think.
Yeah. I'm becoming a repeat offender too. This is what, number
Yeah.
4 for me?
Yeah. Yeah. We usually talk about once a month, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I am Tim Keefe, and I've been a guest on Andrew's podcast. This is the 4th time now. And my background is definitely, I'm a trained academic in philosophy. I do have a master's in the subject, but I did not become a professor wisely many years ago. But I've definitely kept up the reading for the better part of 20 to 25 years. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss different things, particularly from a slightly off the beaten track approach. Like what we're doing today is approaching Heidegger that is not being in time, but going to his lecture series, and there's a lot of them in his entire corpus. And yes, so I'm an interested party, and at least I like to pass myself off as speaking intelligently about this subject.
Awesome. So, do you want to start off with the first bit of notes that I took on phenomenology and theology, or do you want to maybe say a little bit of the introduction, or say a little bit about Heidegger first, Tim?
Yeah, sure. So, definitely for 20th century philosophers, Heidegger is extremely important. There's probably no other philosopher except Wittgenstein who made such an impact in the 20th century as those two, specifically throughout the entire 20th century. So Heidegger was born in the late 19th century and he died in 1976. So most of his adult working life was spent in the 20th century, as was Wittgenstein, although he had died somewhat earlier in the 1950s. And of course, people who come to Heidegger, amateurs and professionals alike, they always focus on being in time. The translation of Sein und Zeit, his magnum opus, which he wrote when he was, I think he was 38 or 39. So he was fairly young at the time when that came out. And that's what people try to start with. But being in time is a beast to get through because it requires a lot of background knowledge of the subjects that Heidegger is dealing with. And Heidegger, being the typical German philosopher, did not write clearly. That translating from German into English is a challenge, but really approaching what he was trying to do is different from what, particularly amateurs who maybe picked up a philosophy book here and there or had a course in college when they covered it and just in passing, really trying to get into Heidegger really takes a lot of concerted effort and study and referencing commentaries and approaching it circularly back and forth to really try to get at the kernel of what he was saying, not just in Being in Time, but in his later works. And what in German is called the Gesamtausgabe, which is the complete works of Heidegger, stretch from his student days when he was in his 20s until close to his 80s. So he had been writing and lecturing about all of these subjects for many, many years, besides Being in Time. And in fact, Being in Time and I forget what the other book are the only two book-length subjects that treat what he was discussing. A lot of it is based in small essays or in lectures, the one of which we're going to cover today, which is just the unfolding of his thinking over many, many decades. And that's the best summary that I can come up with Heidegger, is that he definitely is important enough to merit a lot of close attention paid to it, and somebody who is serious in philosophy really can't get away from Heidegger and his influence.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm learning that more and more the more we get into Heidegger, for sure.
Yeah. And before you get to the notes, so I can give a brief summary of phenomenology itself. I think we touched on this one other time, Andrew. So in general, phenomenology is the approach that was started by Franz Brentano, who was a precursor to Edmund Husserl, who in his own right was an influence on Heidegger, that it is the study of the phenomena. Phenomenon coming from the Greek phenomenon, which is what appears. But particularly in the 20th century vein, it is what appears to consciousness. So if we assert that there is such a thing as consciousness, which is, for all intents and purposes, separate from the mind and separate from mental operations, which Husserl had called psychologism, which is a different subject, that if there is such a thing as consciousness, the core aspect of consciousness is that it's conscious of something, what's called intentionality. So if you see an apple that's present on the desk, you can describe it a certain way. You perceive the apple, but you are aware of the apple itself within your consciousness. And how it appears in your consciousness, tied up with memory also, is different from how you typically perceive it, or how you would describe that you perceive it through your eyes, your vision. So, and
Yeah,
there's a whole,
perceptions.
and there's a whole movement. You can really get into deep with Husserl about what he had to say about phenomenology, but it definitely was a movement that influenced not only Heidegger but people like Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre, definitely in the latter half of the 20th century. But Heidegger took phenomenology and he pushed the boundaries for it, where earlier in his career, he was more of he definitely was influenced by phenomenology, but then he surpassed that later on, particularly in what was called the later period after the turn, as they call it, where he wasn't so concerned more about phenomenology rather than about being and thinking about being in a different way.
Okay.
So that's that in a nutshell. Any
Yeah.
questions so far? Have I lost anybody?
No, that's pretty clear so far. We
Okay.
haven't gotten into the difficult stuff yet.
Yeah. Okay. So you got some notes.
Yeah. Okay, so I wrote more notes for this one than I normally did, mostly because I actually like one thing I found reading this one, Phenomenology and Theology, was I think from us going through some Heidegger before, I had a little bit less trouble understanding some of the language. So that's a good thing, I think. But I just basically took notes on both stuff that I liked and stuff that probably could use a fair amount of verification there, or clarification rather. So
Okay. So, well,
so
one other thing I could say before you get into your notes is that
mhm.
for somebody who's a really serious, who really wants to get seriously into Heidegger, and scholars definitely are like this, is that before he became a philosopher, in quotes, using that term a little loosely, because he probably would have eschewed the moniker, is that he started off in theology. So he was born into a Catholic family, and he received a Catholic education. He was active in the church as an altar boy and all things like that. And then originally he wanted to study theology, but then
Okay.
he changed his focus from theology to mathematics and then eventually to philosophy. But he retained because he was raised a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant country, Germany. So that was his approach. And he was very well versed in things like John Duns Scotus and Aquinas and most of those figures. So he always retained his theological approach to things. He just was kind of moving beyond that in using philosophy as the means to get beyond or address some of the questions that theology wasn't able to address in his mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that does seem like a pretty common theme in his writing.
Right.
Yeah. Okay,
So
so
let's go to your notes.
sure. Yeah, I'll go to the first note that I took here was, oh yeah, okay, so, oh, sorry, I've got something else playing here, just a sec. Sorry, I accidentally started playing something else there. Okay, so the popular understanding of the relationship between theology and philosophy is fond of opposing faith and knowledge, revelation, and reason. Philosophy is that interpretation of the world and of life that is removed from revelation and free from faith. Theology, on the other hand, is the expression of the creedal understanding of the world and of life. In our case, a Christian understanding. Taken as such, philosophy and theology give expression to a tension and a struggle between two different worldviews. I thought that was really interesting because he's talking about the sort of like different perspectives on looking at the similarities and differences between philosophy and theology, particularly from a Christian perspective.
Right. So on the surface, the thing that he is pointing out is that philosophy and theology aren't necessarily the same subject.
Yeah.
Their objects of inquiry are different, although of course there is some overlap, and the way they approach them are different. So Shane, you got any comments on this? Because
Oh, absolutely.
I forget, you're Orthodox, right? Or are you?
I'm more like let's say a beginner Christian,
Okay.
interested in a lot of time. So I don't know to what extent I really would be identifiable as Orthodox, even though that's the church I've been going to for 6 months.
Okay.
But I've been toying with philosophy, and I've believed in God in one form or another for about maybe coming up on a decade. But I only really started seriously trying to figure out what would it actually mean from like a practical, like manifest point of view to no longer be an atheist like I was and actually believe in God. What would that look like? What would an expression of faith look like? How do you actually act that out? So that's still something I'm trying to figure out.
Okay.
So in a lot of ways, I do tend to revert back to secular language more. My scientific training, because I did like a master's in social science at once upon a time. So I'm still trying to transition my mind into let's say a more Christian or a religious worldview. So
Okay.
You're transitioning right now?
I mean, I'm transitioning. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So
I
I don't know if you were there when Andrew was reading the first paragraph.
I did, and I reread it as he did. So if these are red herrings, by all means, just point out if I'm taking this in the wrong direction. But I mean, I always find it interesting that that any point of view could somehow be absent faith. And I kind of think I'm kind of referencing pragmatic philosophy in this sense, where I just don't see how any point of view has enough information or can be divorced enough from like response to an incomplete understanding of a world where you're not getting to most philosophy is not like a formal proof. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't see how you can kind of escape the problem of inserting some sort of faith claim in most arguments unless you are literally building up a philosophical epistemology right from first principles with no gaps in it. So
Isn't that sort of a faith claim too, though? I totally know what you mean, but I mean it seems to me like the more I think about this, because you bring up some valid points on that for sure, is that I mean it seems to me often also like everything is a faith claim, but like that itself is a faith claim too in a way. So it's like it's really hard to know for sure in my opinion, but I'm sure Tim knows what at least Heidegger means when he's talking about this.
Well, let's look at the context here. So, a couple things. This lecture was dated 1917. That's what the preface notes had said. So, at the time, you had philosophy and positivism starting to emerge on the scene. So positivism, generally defined, is that philosophy needs to adopt more of the scientific approach to addressing certain questions about what is nature, what is reality, what is knowledge, and things like that. So that is something that Heidegger was aware of and that he is addressing here. Now, that's philosophy, and there's been many different definitions of philosophy throughout the 2000 odd some years that it has been around, since Greeks or even before then. Theology, on the other hand, as he mentions, is that it's an expression of the creedal understanding of the world and life. So creedal is an important term. It's the credo. Now, what is your creed? I was raised Catholic, so we have the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed. This is a statement of the faith. This is what we as Christians, particularly Catholics, believe. The Orthodox have their creed. The Presbyterians have their creed, and so on and so forth. So you state that as a given. As a Christian of this particular denomination, this is what you believe, and you accept it on faith. You don't necessarily have to have proof for it. So again, he's making the cleavage here, which is an important one, is that philosophy and theology aren't necessarily the same thing. You might ask the question about, well, what is the meaning of life, for example, in philosophy, but in theology, it's more of what is the meaning within a Christian life, or something like that. Shane, you got any comments on that?
I mean, I'm very comfortable with the way you describe the use of positivism and trying to incorporate that, and at least setting that as the benchmark for what you're going to evaluate your philosophy on. Like, to the extent that you can be more positivistic, the better, as opposed to already having these explicit and forgive me if I use this word wrong, but explicit presuppositions or explicit creed that you're kind of scaffolding everything on top of. The only other thing I would add to that is, and we don't have to go down this hole if we want to move, this direction if we want to continue on the essay. But I wonder to what extent, even if I say, okay, I'm going to be doing philosophy, I'm going to be trying to be more positivistic about it, I'm going to explicitly say I'm not basing it on a creed. Again, I don't understand how you can actually construct a worldview without some baseline axiom or structure. So whether you explicitly acknowledge it or not, there's some assumption that you're always building your worldview on, and by definition, it is a faith claim, or it's circular logic to justify it back, because you can never start from like an epistemological clean room where it's like, okay, I have no assumptions, I'm completely objective or positivistic, and I move forward. So it might not be relevant depending where the essay goes, but at minimum, I just like to flag the idea that perhaps what I'll come back to is to see to what extent philosophy actually is being actually less creedal based, even if the creeds are implicit as opposed to explicit. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. And that's a fair point. So, yeah. Okay, so we'll check that box. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe one of the points that Heidegger is trying to make is something like that. There tends to be specifically Christian faith claims more involved with theology than philosophy, generally speaking, and that might be like one of the differences that Heidegger is trying to point out. But I think he explains that in more detail.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
I'll just I'll move on to my next note that I took here, because this will be interesting to get into too, in terms of what you were saying about positivism there. So on the other hand, every positive science is absolutely, not relatively, different from philosophy. Our thesis then is that theology is a positive science, and as such, therefore, is absolutely different from philosophy. Therefore, only by identifying the positive and the scientific character of theology do we approach this discipline as a positive science and acquire the basis for characterizing its possible relationship to philosophy. So, I think that I need definitely a little bit of clarification there, at least, but it seems like he's talking about how basically theology, like, it has more of a positivist scientific approach to it in a way. So he's using that as a way to explain one of the differences between the way that theology is generally done and the way that philosophy in general is specifically done. Or is that what he's talking about there, or what?
It sounds like it. It's probably better if we read the two paragraphs from which that was taken, because you skipped over something about ontology and ontic, which is key Heideggerian. We covered this in the last book.
Yeah. I did make a few notes on that later on, but I did skip it in that section. Yeah.
Okay, so let me see where we could start here. Okay. All right, so this is on the second page. I start at the top. Heidegger says, quote, "We offer only as a guide the following formal definition of science. Science is the founding disclosure, for the sheer sake of disclosure, as of a self-contained region of beings or of being, being meaning das Sein, capital B. Every region of objects, according to its subject matter and the mode of being of its objects, has its own mode of possible disclosure, evidence, founding, and its own conceptual formation of the knowledge thus arising. It is evident from the idea of science as such, insofar as it is understood as a possibility of Dasein, that there are two basic possibilities of science. Sciences of beings, of whatever is, or ontic sciences, and the science of being, the ontological science, philosophy." Okay, so let me unpack this a little here, because this is, if nothing else, the key thing that you take away from Heidegger about Dasein and the ontic and ontological distinction. So Dasein is a German word. It's a generic term meaning existence. But in the Heideggerian context, it means the human being. It's the being that questions being, with a capital B. Primary question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Dasein, the human being, is the only one, at least that we know of, that asks this question. Animals, as other types of beings, don't ask this question, and certainly inanimate objects don't ask this question. So his definition of science, he talks about disclosure, bringing forth into perception or awareness, evidence, founding, and its own conceptual formation of the knowledge thus arising. So he's talking about like scientific method here. Its foundations, conceptual foundations. So then about Dasein, talks about that at great length within Being and Time, which we won't get into now. But he makes a distinction between the ontic, which is about beings themselves, such as an apple, a desk, sunlight, lightning, a car, whatever it is. That's an ontic being. And then the ontological stance, which is about being, capital B, as a whole, which he says is the task of philosophy. Okay, follow me so far? Shane, you good? You understand this? I think you're on mute, Shane.
Yes, these are categories that I think I've lacked the words to know explicitly what to use before. I think I wanted to use the phrase ontological objects to define what he is defining as ontics.
Right. Which is when he describes it, he says this is where you have to be careful. So if you're talking about beings, such as what I just mentioned, sweaters, individual objects, this is the ontic approach of it. Yeah, the lowercase b. But if you're talking about being itself, the something rather than nothing, that is ontological.
Okay, and I'll let you continue. This is good. This is good. We're mapping the space here. This is nice.
Okay, so continuing, Heidegger says, ontic sciences, in each case, thematize a given being that in a certain manner is always already disclosed prior to scientific disclosure. We call the sciences of beings as given of appositum, positive sciences. Their characteristic feature lies in the fact that the objectification of whatever it is that they thematize as oriented directly towards beings, as a continuation of an already existing pre-scientific attitude towards such beings. Ontology, or the science of being, on the other hand, demands a fundamental shift of view from beings to being, and this shift nevertheless keeps beings in view, but for a modified attitude. We shall not go into the question of the method of this shift here. Okay, so the first sentence is key. Ontic sciences in each case thematize a given being that in a certain manner is already disclosed prior to scientific disclosure. So the awareness of an individual being, whatever it is already there, and you don't need science to tell you what it is. This is prior to. Now, science will tell you what it is, that if you're looking at an apple before you, you're aware of this object. It is a being instead of being itself, the capital B. And then science tells you this is an apple, it's of a certain shape, certain color, certain chemical and physical structure, what happens to it under a certain temperature, and blah, blah, blah. So that's what the scientific approach does. But prior to that, you're aware of that there is a being there. Okay, make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So then ontology, in contradistinction, demands a fundamental shift of view. Instead of the individual being as itself. And then it keeps the beings in view, but for a modified attitude. So you're aware that there are particular beings, small b, the ontic, within something that you call being, existence, for lack of a better term. Okay? Follow me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so then the last paragraph. Within the circle of actual or possible sciences of beings, the positive sciences, there is between any two only a relative difference, based on the different relations that in each case orient a science to a specific region of beings. On the other hand, every positive science is absolutely, not relatively, different from philosophy. Our thesis then is that theology is a positive science, and as such, therefore, is absolutely different from philosophy. So what it sounds like to me is that he's prioritizing, in a way, philosophy, particularly from the ontological stance. It is asking the question, what is being with a capital B? Why is there something rather than nothing? Blah, blah, blah. But theology itself is a particular science that is different from philosophy. And he terms it as a positive science, which is dealing with what is disclosed, what is its evidence, and so on and so forth. Okay? That's what I take from that. Anybody have any different readings?
That makes sense to me, especially in context.
That seems clear enough. I really want to keep reading though and see what he means by it, because
he does get into a little more detail about that.
Yeah, because my gut reaction is to strongly disagree with the last sentence, but it could just be a semantics issue. So I don't really think it's constructive for me to say much more until I get a better idea of what he's talking about. If I had known it was just the one essay, I would have done my homework. I thought it was the whole book.
No.
Okay, you don't get graded on this podcast.
No.
Well, no, but I could know what's coming up and have a point of view. But so far, I think it's clear what he's trying to say, to the extent that I understand what I think I'm understanding. So that's, I think I'm ready to move forward if you guys are, as far as I'm concerned.
So then quickly, let me go ahead and summarize the next paragraph where he talks about that. He says, it is immediately clear from the thesis that that theology as a positive science is in principle closer to chemistry and mathematics than to philosophy. And then he says later on, the one, meaning theology, proceeds from the principle of faith, the other from the principle of reason. However, our thesis is theology is a positive science, and as such, absolutely different from philosophy, restating his statement from the first paragraph preceding that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the way you explained that too helped put my note in context, explaining the difference between lowercase b being and uppercase b being, and the difference between ontic and ontology.
Right. It's called the ontic ontological difference.
Yeah.
Find that in scholarly works the way you treat that. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're good, go ahead. Continue.
Okay. All right. The next note I took, this helps. I think this helps explain it slightly more. Thus, our observation obtains a threefold division, or our consideration rather obtains a threefold division. A, the positive character of theology, B, the scientific character of theology, C, the possible relation of theology as a positive science to theology. So I think that to philosophy rather. That's I think that's a good way that he separated out those ways of looking at theology as as like positive, as scientific, and relating theology to philosophy as a positive science.
Right. Now, some comments I can make here is that his tripartite division here, he has sections that treat each of those as we're
Yeah.
continuing through the essay. So again, the reading that I take from here is he prioritizes philosophy over theology. So philosophy, again, is what treats being with a capital B. This does not treat things like, are there God, is there God, or gods, is there angels, miracles, or anything like that. Philosophy doesn't concern itself with these matters, according to Heidegger. Yes, theology might treat these, but we have yet to get further into the lecture to see what he says. But he is saying that theology has a scientific character to it, which for the average person, I would say, who has studied theology, it would seem odd because
especially if you're an atheist or a militant atheist.
that's right. So somebody who has studied theology, and I studied theology in college and have kept up on the subject too for many, many years, it does strike one as odd because theology is, as he had stated in the beginning of the lecture, is that it's a creedal approach. Key thing, the creed, whatever the creed is, be it Catholic or Orthodox, Presbyterian, Anglican, whatever it is. That's what the creed is within the Christian understanding. Okay. One would not think you ask your average churchgoer is, do you think that you can scientifically prove the Apostles' Creed? And they probably would look at you funny.
Yeah.
Of course not. It's something that you accept on faith. However, Heidegger says is that there's a scientific character to theology. So let's see what he has to say.
Yeah, and that's that reminds me too a little bit at least of sort of what you alluded to earlier, Shane. It sounded like you were talking about sort of a pragmatic perspective on religion, and it seems like that's one thing that pragmatist philosophers get into a little bit. Although I know from talking with our friend Hayden Bruce that I do get a little bit confused about that sometimes too. So
I'll just quickly say that
go ahead.
I'm going to save most of my comments because I want to learn more just to make sure I don't say
Sure.
something that he addresses in the future. But
Mhm.
even this idea that he puts forward that somehow religion's based on creed. I mean, to me,
Oh no! Wait a minute. He doesn't say religion. He says theology.
theology. Oh, okay. See, that's
Okay.
okay.
Don't
That's me.
confuse the two. He says
Yes.
theology.
Okay. Theology's based on creed.
Yeah.
Ah,
Like explaining the creed of religion in the way that religion is not necessarily concerned with the same sort of thing.
Well, and again, you got to be careful with the terms. It's
I'm getting
theology,
confused too.
right? So I would say that lots of people make the confusion between religion and theology. You know, as somebody who has studied theology, not in the biblical college. Hayden is studied in the biblical college, so he would definitely say that religion and theology are not the same thing. Getting down to brass tacks, is theology is the study of theos, the divine, the Greek term. Okay, and you remember when we were doing in the Stoic podcast is what the Stoics had defined as theos, not a personal god, a divine presence or force that was operating within the universe, but it was
Yeah,
not the Christian God for certain.
that was the pantheistic view, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But Spinoza also has a pantheistic view too, separate issue. But when you're talking about religion, it is more of this is kind of like that fine distinction between modernity and postmodernity. Okay.
Yeah,
Or
like how
postmodernity and postmodernism. Religion, you could say, is more like a subject of study. What religion are you talking about? Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism? What? That's religion. Within each of those religions, then you have a theology behind that. The explanation, the exploration and description of whatever the divine happens to be within that religion. Make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, that's a good analogy too. And he does talk about how it's within the Christian perspective. And that's one thing that like only fairly recently I understood that distinction, like how Zygmunt Bauman talks about this term that he calls liquid modernity, and um and how and like learning about the distinction between the postmodern era and postmodernism and postmodern writers, and those all have like slightly different meanings too. So yeah, that's a good analogy with to help explain the difference between religion and theology, at least from Heidegger's perspective. Does
Okay.
that make sense to you, Shane?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the mapping mechanism here because I don't have as much formal training in philosophy in terms as well. So I'm going to be cautious with speaking out of terms.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't either. I've just read books and learned from people like Tim.
it's just
Well, you don't have to get too much down in the weeds. I mean, you are following Heidegger's argument in this
yes,
lecture.
yes. Well, that's kind of my goal, right? So I don't think it'll be particularly constructive to say much more right now. But that was worth clarifying that he was talking about theology and not religion. So
Okay.
I'm that's self-validating for me right there. So we can continue from here.
Okay.
Okay.
So before you get to your notes, Andrew, let me go ahead and read the first two paragraphs because I think there's a lot in there.
Mm-hmm.
Because of this. Okay. So it's the section he's defining the positive character of theology. So Heidegger says, a positive science is the founding disclosure of a being that is given and in some way already disclosed. He mentioned this earlier. The question arises, what is already given for theology? One might say, what is given for Christian theology is Christianity as something that has come about historically, witnessed by the history of religion and spirit, and presently visible through its institutions, cults, communities, and groups as a widespread phenomenon in world history. Christianity, the given positum, and hence theology, the science of Christianity. That would evidently be an erroneous characterization of theology, for theology itself belongs to Christianity. Theology itself is something that everywhere in world history gives testimony to its intimate connection with Christianity itself as a whole. Evidently, then, theology cannot be the science of Christianity as something that has come about in world history, because it is a science that itself belongs to the history of Christianity, is carried along by that history, and in turn influences that history. Okay. Comments so far?
I think that's important though. Like a lot of philosophers mention that how you can't escape rather the historical context of any realm of philosophy or anything like theology.
Right. So he's describing Christianity.
Yeah.
Now, going back to the thing about religion, you can ask a scholar or somebody that's somewhat well read on this and saying, can you define what Christianity is? Okay. You have the creeds. You have the institutions. Let's say it's Catholic. Okay. You have the Catholic Church. The Pope is at the head of the Catholic Church. You have the way the churches are designed, and I mentioned before about the creeds and the lay people that are involved in this. You can all describe this as the Catholic denomination of Christianity. Christianity itself is, you believe in Jesus Christ. You take the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, as the Word of God and things like that. So you can all define on the outskirts, on the periphery, about what Christianity is, which is what he was talking about with the institutions, cults, and communities. Also, more importantly, is that about history. Okay, it's a phenomenon in world history. So at one time, there was no Christianity. Then Christianity came on the scene, and it has been part and parcel, particularly of the Western world, for the better part of 2,000 years. So you cannot divorce Christianity from it being a phenomenon in world history. Okay.
Yeah. And
Shane,
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shane, you got any comments on that?
Um, well, let me know if this is something you think's constructive, because I mean, things that ultimately become part of Christianity existed and started to evolve long before that word was created. So, like, if you correctly want to describe the Christian phenomenon, there's traditions, practices, evolutionary phenomenons that allow us to engage in these practices that begin long before Christianity. That you can't really separate from Christianity, right? Because
that's part of the history, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be part of the history. It's just, and the reason I bring that up is that, I think the reason I bring that up is that I just wondered to what anyways, I don't know. I'm not, my thinking isn't quite clear on this, but there's something about the bottom up way that religion kind of came out of other practices to create, a bunch of classes of religions we don't even know the name of, that kind of evolved into the modern manifestations of religion. And I'm just still trying to figure out how that causal chain, as I see it, plays into these terms that he's using to kind of label the phenomenon and put it in different boxes. So that's kind of, I'm trying to map on the way I remember these things to the way he's describing them at this point. So I don't know if that's relevant to, yeah.
Okay. Well, you're showing that you're thinking this through as we're reading, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me get to the second paragraph here. So Heidegger continues. Is theology therefore a science that itself belongs to the history of Christianity in the way that every historical discipline is itself a historical appearance, namely by representing the historical development of its consciousness of history? If this were the case, then we could characterize theology as the self-consciousness of Christianity as it appears in world history. However, theology does not belong to Christianity merely because, as something historical, the latter has a place in the general manifestations of culture. Rather, theology is a knowledge of that which initially makes possible something like Christianity as an event in world history. Theology is a conceptual knowing of that which first of all allows Christianity to become an originally historical event, a knowing of that which we call Christianness, pure and simple. Thus we maintain that what is given for theology, its positum, is Christianness. The latter decides the form theology will take as the positive science that thematizes it. The question arises, what does Christianness mean? Okay.
I really like that because I think what he's saying by positivism kind of resonates with me, because part of what draws me to religion on Christianity is I think like a base desire to assert things. That's why I'm a little less of a skeptic. So in if I'm understanding it correctly, that need to build a kind of positivistic interpretation of the world that I'm going to act out seems to drive me. And I think maybe that's kind of similar to what he's getting at, in the sense that theology is a science, or acts like science. Does anything I just say there make sense, or
I think so. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, I just thought of something too. That this is a bit of a tangent, but you should correct me if I'm wrong, Tim. But is it an aspect of pragmatism too that argues against the idea of positivism?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
going back to my earlier definition, positivism is trying to make philosophy like science or adopting its methods.
Right.
That if you make a metaphysical claim, for example, that if you cannot prove this, if you cannot verify it, then it's a meaningless claim. That's one way to approach it in positivism. Now, in the history of philosophy, positivism has been debunked many different times because it fails its own verification principle.
Right.
So, so yes, positivism as a movement was abandoned a long time ago. However, approaching it from the scientific perspective, or adopting some of that, and there's even a movement within recent years that's called experimental philosophy, which tries to approach things experimentally, sort of scientifically. That, yes, you can do something like that. Now, in the case of pragmatism, yes, they were trying to get away from positivism. So it is not trying to ape the natural sciences, but rather seeing what positive, not positivistic, positive results you can get from making certain claims. You know, Hayden and I were discussing this. He's going to publish it later. We were going over Charles Sanders Peirce about his definition of truth, about the community of inquirers, that whatever inquirer comes in the future asking the same questions and you're arriving at the same results will contribute to what is known as the truth. Things like that. Just constantly doing this instead of here's the truth. It is ahistorical, metaphysical, true for all time and for all peoples type of claims. That's what it tries to avoid.
When's Hayden going to release his episode with you?
Once we're finished with the series.
Oh, okay.
I think we got at least 2 more episodes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So as we're going through Heidegger here, does it make sense? Because he's talking about institution cults. He's talking about it's a historical phenomenon, and then he gets to Christianness. Okay.
Makes sense to me so far.
Okay. Makes sense to you, Shane?
Yeah. It seems to be very coherent so far. Absolutely.
Okay. So go ahead, Andrew. What else you got?
Okay. I think this next note that I took helps explain a little bit more of the specifics about what Heidegger seems to mean. So, theology is the science of faith. This says several things. 1, theology is the science of that which is disclosed in faith, of that which is believed. That which is believed in this case is not some coherent order of propositions about facts or occurrences which we simply agree to, which, although theoretically not self-evident, can be appropriated because we agree to them. 2, theology is accordingly the science of the very component of believing, of faithfulness, in each case a revealed faithfulness, which cannot possibly be any other way. This means that faith, as the component of believing, is itself believed, itself belonged to that which believes. And I think there was one more. Oh yeah, there were 2 more points that he made there. Theology, furthermore, is the science of faith, not only insofar as it makes faith and that which is believed its object, but because it itself arises out of faith. It is the science that faith of itself motivates and justifies. Theology, finally, is the science of faith insofar as it not only makes faith its object and is motivated by faith, but because this objectification of faith itself, in accordance with what is objectified here, has no other purpose than to help cultivate faithfulness itself for its part. So there's a lot there, obviously, but I think it's interesting how he talks about theology is a science of faith, and you have to take, and it's based on faith. So it's like this is probably oversimplifying it, but like just a way of justifying your faith and explaining it in a scientific way. If does that sound right?
What do you think, Shane?
Okay, before I tell you what I think, is it meant to sound circular? It's basically saying it's a self-referential system that justifies itself? It's based on its own axiom, and am I missing something there? Or
well, yeah, at least at first phase, what he's saying is that, okay, so let's back up a minute. So generally, I would agree is that theology is the science of faith, because regardless of what you can describe theologically and not philosophically, key distinction here, that theology is something you accept on faith. So you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Okay, that's in core Christian theology. Is that something you can necessarily prove? No. Is that something that you accept on faith? Yes. And so theology is the science of that faith. Then, I'd have to read this. I really have to read this over again. What Heidegger is saying is that theology also takes faith as its object. And it's a science of, quote, proving that faith and supporting that faith as one proceeds forward. How's that sound?
I think in broad strokes, I do understand what he was getting at there. I'm now really curious to see what he means by philosophy.
Okay.
To kind of, by matter of contrast, to kind of illuminate it. Unless there's some overarching point you think that's particularly worth drawing out of there that perhaps I don't know to have my attention drawn to just of my own accord.
Okay. Well, here's a paragraph here that I would like to read that I think is enlightening. So this is on page 44 towards the bottom. Heidegger says, Luther said, quote, faith is permitting ourselves to be seized by the things we do not see. I think that's a pretty good definition. Yet faith is not something that merely reveals that the occurring of salvation is something happening. It is not some more or less modified type of knowing. Rather, faith is an appropriation of revelation that co-constitutes the Christian occurrence. That is, the mode of existence that specifies a factical Dasein's Christianness as a particular form of destiny. Faith is the believing, understanding mode of existing in the history revealed that is occurring with the crucified, meaning Jesus. So let me unpack some terms here. So we've already defined what Dasein is. Factical refers to facticity, which is the there-ness, okay? Related to, there's a term that Heidegger uses, it's called Geworfenheit, thrownness. So as Dasein, the being, you are thrown into the world, meaning that you did not choose to emerge into the world. You found yourself here. You found yourself within a certain family. You found yourself within a certain sex or gender. You found yourself within a certain linguistic community, meaning that you're a native speaker of English or something else. So this is what facticity refers to. It's just there. It's a bare fact, something that you can't argue against or negate. It just is. Okay, so that's what factical means. Now he says, faith, the mode of existence that specifies a factical Dasein's Christianness, there's that term again, as a particular form of destiny. Faith is the believing, understanding mode of existing in the history revealed that is occurring with the crucified. So I take that to mean is that the Christianness is the factical Dasein as a questioning being within a Christian milieu as part of the movement within world history that one is a Christian, one is born within a Christian community, and that it is a destiny because there is a telos associated with, a telos sort of associated with being a Christian, because at some point, with the second coming and so on and so forth. How's that make?
Does
that make sense?
What's telos mean again?
Telos is the Greek word of an end. Okay. Teleology. And there's a specific theological term, eschatology, which is the second coming, more or less, the revealing of Christ in the second coming.
Oh, interesting. N.T. Wright used that word. I think he gave like 8 or 9 definitions of that word.
Yes, you can define that many different ways.
Yeah, many different ways. And I still didn't. You would ask me what it was before you said it. I wouldn't have been able to.
Right.
I thought it's something to do with time, though, right? Eschatology is like a perception of time over time, like how you perceive the timal course of things.
Right. The second coming, in particular, is what they're referring to. Is that if you believe in the second coming, Christ will return to the earth at some point. When that's going to happen, nobody knows. Nobody's seen it yet, but at some undefined point in the future, it will happen.
It's like more of an academic second coming theology, and much more formal and less crazy than like religious cults who believe in that sort of thing.
Yeah, or they tried to speed it up by mass suicide.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think he was trying to draw another distinction, though. I'm not going to try to get at what it is, but I think there was something that made it much broader than just the second coming, or I just was missing what he was saying. That aside, coming back to the description there he gave of faith, that does seem to make a lot of sense to me. I like the way you contextualize that within other phenomenon. So again, that just seemed very accurate. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but I couldn't see anything to disagree with. It sounded very just descriptive.
Well, I like Luther's definition. Faith is permitting ourselves to be seized by the things we do not see.
That is a good definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do like that.
That's definitely a workable definition of faith to me. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that's good for that section. What other notes you got?
Okay. So there, yeah, after that I put, okay, so therefore, ontology functions only as a corrective to the ontic, and in particular pre-Christian content of basic theological concepts, but it is not of the essence of philosophy, and it can never be established by philosophy itself or for its own purpose, that it must have such a corrective function for theology. So, I think I need a little clarification on that again, but he's talking about ontology is a corrective for pre-Christian theological concepts, but it's not the essence of philosophy.
Okay, can you read that whole passage one more time?
Yeah. Therefore, ontology functions only as a corrective to the ontic, and in particular pre-Christian content of basic theological concepts, but it is not of the essence of philosophy, and it can never be established by philosophy itself or for its own purpose, that it must have such a corrective function for theology. Is he talking about how philosophy cannot help us define ontology? That's a project for theology, and theology is a corrective for the ontic and particular pre-Christian theology?
Well, okay, so let's unpack this. So he's referring to the ontic ontological distinction again.
Right.
So ontology, which is a being with a capital B, is a corrective against the ontic, being with a small b.
Right.
So as he specifies many different places, is that when you overly concern yourself with the ontic, it's missing the forest for the trees. That's probably a better analogy to look at it.
Okay.
The ontic is the trees. Being is the forest. So if you're questioning about the forest, that is ontology, but the trees themselves are ontic. So ontology, questioning being, why is there something rather than nothing type of questions, that forces you not to focus on the individual beings, even though the individual beings are part of that, but you're not so focused on it. And I think we covered this in the last time we looked at Heidegger, is that he's trying very hard to make the distinction, first of all, but to get you to see past the ontic, because this is where metaphysics comes into play. And metaphysics is not what you want, questioning being as itself, because for a large part, Heidegger's main project is to question what it is about being. And eventually, later on, he ditches philosophy and he terms it more like thinking. Instead of philosophizing about being, you're thinking about being. But how do we think about it? And that's where the poet comes in. You remember last time we discussed about this?
Yeah.
So that's getting to there. Now, the thing about Christian, the pre-Christian is, at least the way I read it, is that philosophy is not like theology, and that taking the ontological approach is getting beyond the specific theological concepts, because instead of asking about, or instead of focusing on what the subject of theology is, about God or gods, angels, miracles, and so on, those are ontic beings, but you're not questioning the being of it itself. Okay, so if Christ is the Son of God, Christ is an ontic being in some respects. But what is it about the being beyond that? Now, fast forwarding a little bit, maybe we could cover this at a later podcast, is an interesting theologian who treats this, very much influenced by Heidegger, is Paul Tillich, who talked about the Godhead. And you hear this term in certain kinds of theologians where it is, what is behind God? If you assert that there is a God, but what is beyond God? It's the being that God is a part of, the Godhead, as they describe it.
Oh,
That's a real
interesting.
head stretcher.
Yeah.
But we won't get into that here. Okay, so that's the way I read that passage. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, it's all seeming descriptive. I can't, I'm not, I think I'm understanding it. I don't really have anything constructive to ask, except perhaps in this framework of ontics and ontology, how would you bring in the concept of epistemology within these sets of definitions?
Well, he's not
Maybe,
even asking about epistemology. That's a separate subject.
I mean,
Yeah,
if you,
he gets into a really narrow focus, and like when we were like, I think when we were talking about metaphysics, or I forget whether it was being or metaphysics. Yeah, I think it was metaphysics. He was
It was about
talking about.
metaphysics, yeah.
Yeah, he was thinking, I'm gonna sidestep this approach, and I'm gonna get more specific here on what it means to even ask the question of what metaphysics is.
Right, because in Heidegger's definition, metaphysics is concerned with the ontic, individual beings.
Yeah.
Again, in his definition. Now, some people will take Heidegger to task about what he defines about metaphysics, but again, that's his project. He is trying to get beyond metaphysics. And in fact, we're going to see a little bit of this when we get to the Nietzsche essay, where he describes in that essay, in so many words, particularly in his 4 volumes of work on Nietzsche, is that Nietzsche is the last great metaphysician, he calls him.
Oh, right, because he had the
The will to
he had,
power.
right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Again, separate issue. We could spend hours discussing that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to take the reins a minute and focus on the section on the scientific character of theology, because
Sure.
it's got some interesting things here. Okay. So he says in this section, Heidegger says, theology is the science of faith. Already established that. This says several things. 1, theology is the science of that which is disclosed in faith, of that which is believed. That which is believed in this case is not some coherent order of propositions about facts or occurrence which we simply agree to, which, although theoretically not self-evident, can be appropriated because we agree to them. Okay, we already covered that one. Number 2, theology is accordingly the science of the very comportment of believing, of faithfulness, in each case a revealed faithfulness, which cannot possibly be any other way. This means that faith, as the comportment of believing, is itself believed. Itself belongs to that which is believed. Number 3, theology, furthermore, is the science of faith, not only insofar as it makes faith and that which is believed its object, but because it itself arises out of faith. It is the science that faith of itself motivates and justifies. And finally, 4, theology finally is the science of faith insofar as it not only makes faith its object and is motivated by faith, but because the subjectification of faith itself, in accordance with what is objectified here, has no other purpose than to help cultivate faithfulness itself for its part. So this is where I think there's a little bit of a circularity here. I think you were right to point that out, Shane, is that makes faith its object and is motivated by faith. But because of this objectification of faith itself, in accordance with what is objectified here, has no other purpose than to help cultivate faithfulness itself for this part. So that goes back to that earlier point about the creedal approach in theology. The creed is what you accept, what you believe, because creed comes from the Latin credo, meaning I believe. Take the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or whatever it is creed. This is a statement of the faith. Okay, this is what I believe in. Can I prove this? No. At least as far as I think so. This is what I believe. By reciting the creed, you're also bolstering your faith, because as a community, when you read it, because, sitting in Mass so many times when I was a kid, you read this faith and people just drone through it. Okay, but I think there was a collective phenomenon approaching there, is that the people, as the Christian community in that church, were reciting this faith and bolstering their own faith in this. Maybe they weren't conscious of it, but maybe they were subconscious of it, that they stated their faith. And you do this every time you're sitting in the Mass, for example, as a restatement of your faith, that yes, as a Christian of the Catholic denomination, this is what I believe. And the theology is taking faith, because now you're taking into a realm of study instead of just reciting it. So what is the basis beneath this? Because the creeds themselves, if you know the history of the Christian church, took a long time, and there were councils the Nicene Creed came out of the Council of Nicaea, to really narrow down what is it that we believe as Christians? What is the creed here? What do we believe? And the theology helped to support that creed. Okay, does this make sense so far?
Yeah.
It does. It does.
Okay.
The more I learn about theology from sort of a more philosophical perspective like this, the more I wish I had been more open-minded to learning about these sort of subjects when I was a militant atheist, because I think it would have helped draw me out of the militancy of my atheism.
Yeah, I mean, I can say personally is that theology is also a fascinating subject to get into, as is
Yeah.
philosophy. Philosophy has a much wider berth because it covers so many different subjects. But theology, you could, I mean, there is a reason why you go to divinity school, and there are people that get PhDs and they're scholars in this for all of their lives, because it's just a rich vein of really getting into theology that had existed at the time of the church fathers, but even beforehand when you're looking at the Greeks, because theology in and of itself is the study of the theos. There also was theology at work before Christianity. So, going back to Shane's earlier point is that before Christianity arrived on the scene, you had some kind of theology at work to describe the gods, or how do the gods, operate? Were the gods real? Questioning if the gods were real or not, or just accepting them as manifestations of something else, was around the time when you started to see philosophy. And, I think this ties into Heidegger's point, is that ontology is a corrective to the ontic. Okay, so you could apply philosophy with theology itself, in that you can question theology, but theology has a special domain in that it's concerning itself with faith. So it's not about truth claims. His earlier point about a set of propositions, that's more in the province of philosophy, but not so much in theology. Okay, and again, that's my reading.
Yeah. Anything to say about that, Shane?
Yeah. Okay. See how well I could do it. Okay. So maybe the issue here is that I have like my own hazy working definition of theology. So maybe I'm muddling the waters, but it's kind of consistent with where I'd started with when we first kind of read that very first paragraph, because I would I would I would say that if I'm performing philosophy, like I believe that every single action is directional. So the moment I try to apply philosophy, I make a statement. Implicit in that statement are objectives that I'm trying to achieve, which means I have implicit values which give rise to why I want to achieve those objectives. And again, whether I know them or not. So when I think of what theology is to me is the nature of God, it's nature of good and evil, it's nature of purpose. So for me, philosophy by definition would flow from theology, because theology is the study of why I would even do philosophy in the first place. So maybe that's just a way of looking at it from a non-philosophical way. Maybe I'm looking at it in a more, I don't know, consequentialist way, or causal chain kind of way. I'm not sure exactly what phrase to use there. So maybe I'm just looking at it differently to kind of rig it so that it works in the way I want it to. But at the same time, I would be really interested if you could clarify if I'm misunderstanding something there, if I'm making up my own definitions, or perhaps there's something I don't understand about how he's going to define philosophy in the future. Maybe that will kind of clarify some distinction I'm not quite seeing yet.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I think like you can look at this from the opposite perspective too. Like one of the things we were saying about when Heidegger writes about metaphysics, for example, is you can examine the question of what it means to examine the question of metaphysics. So you can like philosophize about the question of what it means to be religious and what it means to have faith and whether you should believe in God or not. Like so you can examine what it be. You can do this like endless regression of what it means to examine any particular form of question. Like to me, it seems like you can you can just look at it from any sort of perspective that you want to, in terms of like what it means to answer those questions, or what those questions mean, or what the answer is to those questions, or something like that. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing this, though.
Sorry, you dropped off there. What was the last point?
My last point was maybe I'm just overanalyzing this, though.
Well, okay, here's one way to look at it. So again, in Heidegger's definition, he's making a distinction between philosophy and theology. They're not the same subject. However, we can jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to somebody in the medieval period, namely Thomas Aquinas, who merged the two. So Aquinas was a Catholic, he was a believer. That much is true. And he used philosophy, particularly Aristotle, and this is where the schoolmen emerged on the scene in the 13th and the 14th century. They were using Aristotle and logic to prove the theology against attacks. You know, for example, two of Aquinas's main works are the Summa Theologicae, which is the laying out of everything in the theological approach that he had, but also the Summa Contra Gentiles. The Gentiles referred to the people who were attacking the Christian doctrine, criticizing it. So Aquinas didn't need Aristotle to prove to himself because he was a believer. He used philosophy to defend against attacks for the Christian faith. That's where the Contra Gentiles comes in. Be it atheists or Jews, you know, because the Jews could attack the Christians regarding that as well. So that's where you have a merging of the two. Now, Heidegger would probably say, although I'm not versed in everything that he had to say about that, is this was one avenue of where this is where the seeds of the confusion were laid. You know, we were talking about Descartes earlier, is that with the mind-body distinction. Okay.
Yeah.
When Descartes came on the scene, he cleaved the two, whereas before nobody really thought that the mind and the body were separate.
Right. And
but
we
now they were.
More recent scientific evidence has shown that the body and the mind are the same thing.
That's right. Well, they're not. I wouldn't say they're necessarily the same thing, but they definitely are inseparable. The body can affect the mind, and the mind can affect the body.
Yeah, yeah.
But in the case of Descartes, you're not making them two separate substances. Key distinction here. There's one substance, and then there's another substance, and the two don't mix.
Right.
Okay. But going back to Aristotle, or sorry, Aquinas is when you had a mixture of the two. You had philosophy defending theology, and not vice versa.
Right.
And then even in the 20th century, you had what they're called the Thomists, which accept Aquinas's approach. And they still use, maybe to some extent, scientific methods to prove, in so many different ways, the Christian faith. Okay. But Heidegger's not dealing with that here. He's trying to look at theology. He's defining theology as a science. It's a science of faith. And what does that mean? I don't know if that cleared up the question, but that's just another way that you can approach this.
Yeah, only I would add to I would say to that is, I guess just the way my mind's structured. It's like if you ask whether the mind and body are the same thing or not, it would all be for in what purpose are you defining the words for? Because a word only is going to have a definition in the context somebody's using it, which is based upon some sort of objective to draw whatever distinctions you're trying to make, right? And as you've gone forward, Tim, you kind of referred to why he was defining the words why he's defining the words the way he is, because he's trying to get at a certain type of thing, right? So so I don't know I don't think there's anything else to remark on this particular point, but I don't know what you intended to go to next. But at some point, if we could get to what he actually means by philosophy, I'd be really curious to hear. This has been the best introduction to build the climax, because I'm really kind of curious what it's going to end up being.
Okay.
But by all means, take the reins to wherever you're going, because you're more familiar with the material. So don't do what you think is the natural progression. So
sure. Okay. So let me go ahead and skip down to page 48 towards the bottom. Okay. Well, let me go before him. So here's a point from an earlier paragraph where he says, theology is systematic only when it is historical and practical. It is historical only when it is systematic and practical. And it is practical only when it is systematic and historical. That's a nice tautological sounding thing here. Okay. Earlier, he talked about systematic theology, which in itself is a specific subdiscipline, I'd say, within theology. Systematic is, defining Christian theology. And there are textbooks that are defined as systematic theology. Tillich has 3 volumes devoted to this, although he has a Heideggerian take on things. Lots of other different systematic theologies that you can read and you can study. So theology is systematic only when it is historical and practical. Historical only when it is systematic and practical. And is practical only when it's systematic and historical. Nice wraparounds there. Okay. But later on, down in the lower paragraph, he says, etymologically regarded, theology means science of God. Aha. Here's another definition. But God is in no way the object of investigation in theology, as, for example, animals are the theme of zoology. Let me read that again. But God is in no way the object of investigation in theology, as, for example, animals are the theme of zoology. He continues, theology is not speculative knowledge of God. And we hit upon the concept of theology no better when we expand the theme and say, the object of theology is the all-inclusive relationship of God to man and of man to God. In that case, theology would be the philosophy or the history of religion. In short, Religionswissenschaft, the German term. Even less is it the psychology of religion, that is, the science of man and his religious states and experiences, the analysis of which is supposed to lead ultimately to the discovery of God in man. One could, however, admit that theology does not coincide in general with speculative knowledge of God, the scientific study of religion, or the psychology of religion, and still want to stress that theology represents a special case of the philosophy and history of religion, etc., namely, the philosophical, historical, and psychological science of the Christian religion. Okay, so can you guys unpack that?
I don't know. I mean, I'd say it sounds like he's kind of saying some of the points that we've gone over already about theology and religion and like examine like is one of the points that he's making that theology is sort of examining faith rather than God specifically?
Well, in his definition, he doesn't mention faith here. Now,
Okay.
earlier he says that theology is a science of faith. And then here is an additional definition that it's a science of God. But you're not studying God as an object, as like an animal, like you're studying a cheetah in zoology.
So you're studying it like more like God is more from an ontological perspective than an ontic perspective. Would that be accurate?
Bingo.
Okay.
That sounds to be the most plausible approach to that, is that, theology does not set out to prove God. You take God as a given.
Right.
Okay. Philosophy, on the other hand, might be tasked with trying to prove God. Going back to my Aquinas example.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So theology, God is already accepted as a given. But in his definition, now that's not the case with all theologians, because there's many theologians who try to define what God is, or in the case of negative theology, what God is not. So in his definition, God is not an object of investigation in theology. And there's no speculative knowledge of what God is either. Rather, it is the relationship of God to man and man to God. Okay?
Does that make more sense with what you were saying about in terms of his definition of philosophy, Shane?
I couldn't quite follow the quote because I wasn't sure what pages it was on in terms of the document I'm actually looking at.
It's on page 48, the last paragraph.
Etymologically regarded that theology means science of God.
Yeah.
That's okay. Because it's at some point he seemed to almost say something about theology subsuming within it philosophy. Did I hear that correctly as I was listening?
So later on he says, where is it here? In that case, theology would be the philosophy or the history of religion, the relationship of God to man and man to God.
Okay, so then how do you reconcile that to the fact that his definition of philosophy wasn't, or was it as positive? Because there was some distinction he was trying to draw between philosophy and theology. So maybe I should already have the answer to my own question, but how is it exactly that in this particular regard theology can operate as a philosophy if there's that fundamental distinction?
Well, theology is not a philosophy. That's key. And again, this is my reading. So
how could it operate as a philosophy that I don't understand? How could it play the role of a philosophy if it's fundamentally not a philosophy? Is that not, or am I misunderstanding what he says in that sentence?
You might be misunderstanding. So when he says, okay, so theology is the relationship of God to man and of man to God, then he says, in that case, theology would be the philosophy or the history of religion, in short, Religionswissenschaft, specific German term. Even less, it is the psychology of religion, that is the science of man and his religious states and experiences, the analysis of which is supposed to lead ultimately to discovery of God and man. So again, the way I'm interpreting this is theology is a special field of inquiry. God is accepted as a given. It does not question whether God exists or not. Okay. Theology, we're studying the theos of the divine. So we're already presupposing that there is a theos, a divine. We call it God. It's not studying God as an animal in zoology, as that specific one. And it does not speculate about what God is, speculative knowledge. So then God to man, he gets to that. He does not question about history of religion. He does not question about the psychology of religion. Okay. Theology represents a special case of the philosophy and history of religion, the philosophical, historical, and psychological science of the Christian religion. Okay. Maybe I should read the next paragraph. So he says, yet it is clear from what we have said that systematic theology is not a form of the philosophy of religion applied to the Christian religion. So let me back up a minute. I think what he's saying here about the philosophy of religion is, what is religion itself? How do you define religion? What are the propositions, key term, what are the propositions that religion states? God exists. Okay, well, let's look at this philosophically. What does that mean? Can you define God? What does it refer to? And blah, blah, blah. Make sense so far? This is what philosophy does versus theology.
Like Bertrand Russell talking about whether arguing whether God is omnipotent or not, and those sorts of philosophical arguments.
Right. So philosophy is dealing with truth claims and definitions, among other things.
Right.
But theology doesn't deal with that in Heidegger's definition.
Right.
Okay. So we have said that systematic theology is not a form of the philosophy of religion applied to the Christian religion. So philosophy of religion, you could apply that to Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, or whatever it is. And we're not applying to the Christian religion. Nor is church history a history of religion limited to the Christian religion. In all such interpretations of theology, the idea of this science is abandoned from the very beginning. That it is not conceived with regard to the specific positive character of theology, but rather is arrived at by the way of a deduction and specialization of non-theological sciences, philosophy, history, and psychology, sciences that indeed are quite heterogeneous to one another. Of course, to determine where the limits of the scientific character of theology lie, that is, to determine how far the specific exigencies of faithfulness itself can and do press for conceptual transparency and still remain faithful, is both a difficult and essential problem. No shit. It is tied most closely to the question about the original ground of the unity of the three disciplines of theology. Okay, so again, I think he's making the point is that theology is in no way philosophy, nor is it the philosophy of religion. Kind of restating an earlier point.
Okay.
Is it becoming clear, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, as he's kind of tightening the news, so to speak, on theology, I see how it's getting put into that box. So I'm going to be muddling. I'm going to be chewing on this idea for a while, because I still intuitively I don't like it, but there's something I can really take issue with so far. So
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that happens with Heidegger.
yeah. Well, can you at least sit with the distinction between philosophy and theology?
as he's laying it out right now, I don't see a single issue with it. It's all seeming to make sense. So I'm seeing the distinction.
Hmm.
I tried like I think if I was a smarter person, I might be able to kind of shift the starting point and express that in a coherent way, which would realign it.
Yeah.
But in terms of how he's going about it, from whatever starting point,
Right.
it is making complete sense. So he's constructing a coherent lens, let's say. So
Right.
as far as I can tell, so I don't. Yeah, I could try to take issue with it and just muddle around, but so far
Mhm.
it's making sense.
Right. So something that I mentioned to Andrew in the last podcast when we covered Heidegger is that you have to read Heidegger more than once and you have to sit with it, because it might not be evident at some point. This is not like reading Sam Harris, for example, who I think is a sloppy thinker in
Oh,
many
I
different
think it's a horrible thinker.
respects, but he reads clearly enough where the average person could look at that and they say, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty smart now after I read Sam Harris. I can follow his argument." But when you go to Heidegger, it's just like, say what? And then you got to read it again, and then you got to sit with it, and then you got to read it again, and you got to sit with it, and then maybe you get some insight about what he's saying. From the beginning of this lecture, he is making it quite clear is that definitely in his mind, philosophy and theology are not the same thing.
Yeah.
If
That
anything,
that's
if
very true.
anything, philosophy is prior to theology because of the range that philosophy questions. Because
Yeah.
philosophy is about questioning.
Because you're not necessarily asking specifically theological questions in philosophy.
Right. Theology is more or less a self-contained discipline. Remember what he said in the very beginning. It's the creedal approach. Okay. Within theology, you have a creed. The creed is we've already hashed this out. We've stated this is what we believe. Then you start from there in limited your limited purview to ask other kinds of questions. But as he said earlier, is that it's a science of God, but it is also not philosophy of religion. Main difference there. You're not even questioning. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next section where he says the relation of theology as a positive science to philosophy. Here we go, Shane. We're getting there.
Oh yeah, that's actually the next
Okay.
section of my notes that I wanted to skip to.
All right. So let's go to the first paragraph. He says, if faith does not need philosophy, the science of faith as a positive science does. And here again, we must distinguish. The positive science of faith does not need philosophy for the founding and primary disclosure of its positum, Christianness, which founds itself in its own manner. The positive science of faith needs philosophy only in regard to its scientific character, and even then only in a unique, restricted, though basic way. Continuing. As a science, theology places itself under the claim that its concepts show and are appropriate to the being that it has undertaken to interpret. But is it not the case that that which is to be interpreted in theological concepts is precisely that which is disclosed only through for and faith? Is not that which is supposed to be grasped conceptually here something essentially inconceivable, and consequently something whose content is not to be fathomed, and whose legitimacy is not to be founded by purely rational means? Okay. Comments?
Well, I like what he said there, that you can't find it with purely rational means. That makes sense.
Right. This much seems to be self-evident when you're talking about theology or religion. Sure, lots of people over the centuries have tried to rationally prove theology. theological claims. But I think in the end, those fall short because it's really not something that you can do because, taking Heidegger's definition, it's a science of faith.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah, again, I'm a broken record at this point. It's making sense. I found my mind wandering a little bit to like imagining that because he as a philosopher, he started as philosophy as his starting point. Maybe that's why everything flows from the philosophy. But now I'm doing a little bit of mind reading. But again, I don't really have not as many constructive things to add as I might want. So
Well, like Tim was saying with Thomas Aquinas, like it depends on whether you start off from a religious perspective or not. In my opinion, like if you're not starting off from a religious perspective, then you can go from philosophy to theology maybe. But if you are starting off from a religious perspective, it would make sense that you would start off from a theological perspective first.
yeah, he's being very sophisticated in the way he's creating the relationship between all the different concepts. So I mean, I can only upload it so quickly. So I mean,
Yeah.
like you were saying earlier, right? So I think too, I think perhaps maybe if I'm lucky enough to participate when we talk about the Nietzsche, maybe seeing the way he interprets things that I've seen other people interpret, maybe that'll make it easier for me, given my lack of ability to be as communicatively effective as I might want to be, to kind of maybe see the distinctions that are more meaningful with an actual concrete example. But yeah, it's just it's very, very interesting so far. So yeah.
Okay. So moving along, he has some definitions of what philosophy is. Okay, here we go. Drum roll, please.
Wait, where is it? I want to read this one.
Okay, so we're starting on page 52.
52. Okay, which paragraph?
Well, look at the italicized. So he has
Okay.
some statements that are italicized here that I'm going to go ahead and read through.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Now I can follow along. Great.
So the first one is from the second paragraph. He says, therefore, ontology functions only as a corrective to the ontic, and in particular, pre-Christian content of basic theological concepts. You mentioned that one earlier, Andrew.
Yeah.
So the other one is towards the bottom of the page where he says, philosophy is the formally indicative ontological corrective of the ontic, and in particular of the pre-Christian content of basic theological concepts. That's almost a restatement. So
yeah.
moving along, let's go to page 53, where he says, philosophy is the possible, formally indicative ontological corrective of the ontic, and in particular of the pre-Christian content of basic theological concepts. But philosophy can be what it is without functioning factically as this corrective.
Yeah. Okay.
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 Seem clearer now?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm wrong, but if I'm getting it, maybe it's in his mind, philosophy is kind of like a tool or a language or kind of like a medium in my mind here, because because he's saying philosophy is the possible, formal, indicative, ontological corrective. So possible means it's occurring, formal means you're explicit, indicative means, what does indicative mean in that context?
It indicates, points to.
It points to, okay, so it's something that's possibly formally directive, ontologically corrective. So you're clarifying the relationship between the ontics, right? And in particular of the pre-Christian content of the. So yeah, it's like the medium by which you're literally communicating these ideas through, right? It's cleaning up that medium. It's organizing that space. Is one way of paraphrasing that clumsily in my mind.
Right. Okay. So here's my take on that. So if you start with a theological concept, such as there is a divine, there is an other world, you can run through the gamut of what a theological concept is. That is not necessarily Christian. Any kind of theology of whatever religion it is, take your pick. Okay. There's your starting point. And that's where the pre-Christian comes in. So from that, then you have a theological wrapper around that. This is what theology does. Okay, so I could throw out another term there, which I think is very apt to this, very much ties into to Heidegger, but also to later philosophers. It's an ontological commitment. Okay, so if you believe that God exists, you're making an ontological commitment. There's this being that you define as God, or whatever name you choose to call it. You commit that it does exist. You haven't provided a proof for it, but you committed that it does exist. Okay, makes sense so far? Okay, so you have an ontological commitment to these theological concepts, pre-Christian. Then you have the wrapper, the theological wrapper around those concepts. Then it might be, say, a shading of that as Christian. Could be Christian, could be Buddhist, could be Jewish, whatever it is. But now, with those concepts, those are ontic, specific beings. Okay? Follow me so far? Okay. Philosophy comes in when it provides this ontological corrective. So it's even questioning all of that comes before. Starting from your theological concepts, moving all the way back, going with the wrapper analogy, is philosophy is the wrapper around all of this, questioning what it is. Why is there X, Y, and Z? Okay? So that's the task of philosophy, definitely in Heidegger's definition. And then he continues saying, but philosophy can be what it is without functioning factically as this corrective. So you're not committing that this is what you're doing. Okay? You might be philosophizing without even knowing it, or explicitly stating that that is what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I could ask you, what are you doing? I'm philosophizing. All right. So that has a certain charged term to it. What are you doing? I'm thinking. Okay. Thinking is a little more general. I'm pondering. I'm wondering about these things. Okay. So that's my reading of that definition. What do you guys think?
That makes sense to me.
How about you? How about you, Shane?
It just, I mean, I'm definitely, there's definitely some motivated reasoning going on. I can recognize that in myself, but I'm also trying to reconcile it to like my previous idea castles. But it still sounds like philosophy is a tool that's serving some other end.
It is.
In the same way that theology is serving a different end from philosophy.
Yeah. So I mean, as he's going through it, yeah, I mean, they just seem like useful distinctions then to kind of show. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, again, I still don't have anything to really disagree with as far as, or it all sounds like I say coherent. So
okay.
Yeah.
So let me go ahead and continue. This is getting towards the end of the essay, but the next paragraph, I think, sheds additional light on this. So Heidegger says, this peculiar relationship does not exclude, but rather includes the fact that faith, as a specific possibility of existence, is in its innermost core the mortal enemy of the form of existence that is an essential part of philosophy and that is factically ever-changing. Faith is so absolutely the mortal enemy that philosophy does not even begin to want in any way to do battle with it. This existential opposition, existential with two L's refers to existence, between faithfulness and the free appropriation of one's whole Dasein is not first brought about by the sciences of theology and philosophy, but is prior to them. Furthermore, it is precisely this opposition that must bear the possibility of a community of the sciences of theology and philosophy, if indeed they are to communicate in a genuine way, free from illusions and weak attempts at mediation. Accordingly, there is no such thing as a Christian philosophy. That is an absolute square circle, which is kind of a contradiction. No such thing as a square circle. On the other hand, there is likewise no such thing as a neo-Kantian or axiological or phenomenological theology, just as there is no phenomenological mathematics. Phenomenology is always only the name for the procedure of ontology, a procedure that essentially distinguishes itself from that of all other positive sciences. Okay, so one point about this. Heidegger wrote this lecture essay before Being in Time. This was dated 1917. Being in Time came out in 1926. So in here, he is working out some of his ideas that eventually appear in Being in Time. And he was still rooted in the phenomenological tradition, which I defined earlier in the podcast as that letting the phenomenon appear. Okay. So what he's saying in this paragraph is that there is no such thing as a phenomenological theology, because that's kind of a contradiction. Phenomenology is just letting phenomenon appear regardless of what they are. They could be pre-scientific or pre-theological, prehistorical, or whatever it is. And he says there is no such thing as a Christian philosophy. Interesting point, because later on, some people bill themselves as a Christian philosopher. But at least in Heidegger's definition, this seems to belie the term, because one is a Christian, one already has made some kind of a, shall we say, an ontological commitment. But it is not approaching it from, I'm not trying to do this from any kind of preordained standpoint. Make sense?
Right. Yeah. Does that make sense to you, Shane?
No. Something here is really, really bugging me.
Okay.
Wait. Furthermore, it is precisely the opposition that must be the possibility of insight. Where does he? Gosh darn it! It's like I just heard it as you said it. Now I can't find it when I'm reading it. On the other hand, it's like, where's that? Okay, sorry. Okay, so what I'm taking issue is that it seems he's like baking in the idea that there's a true form to things, and that philosophy can somehow access it because it doesn't have preconditions baked into it. And okay. I don't understand. And because where do you use the word object at some point? What sentence am I thinking of? I can't find it. Yes. Because the thing is objects only exist relative, like the object exists after the goal in my way of looking at the world. It's like there's no such thing as the true form of the object, because an object's always you can never fully define anything. It's always a limited, hemmed in definition of something, because you could always add more detail to your examination of any particular object, right?
Right. So and what you're stating is phenomenology.
Okay.
So phenomenology, going back to the earlier definition, is that it's studying the phenomenon, what appears, particularly what appears to consciousness. Mm-hmm. And this is before you even describe the object. What you're looking at is an apple on the table, but that's already describing it after you have perceived, and after you have perceived it in consciousness, the scientific approach. But when it is in your consciousness, you have an object, but you haven't defined it. The difficulty with phenomenology is that when it's kind of something that is subjective. When you read it and you sit with it, it's like, okay, so I know that I'm conscious of something, but I'm not defining it yet. As soon as I say it's an apple, it's a car, it's a sweater, I've already defined it. I've applied a term to it.
Yeah.
But phenomenology doesn't even go that far. It starts from the conscious awareness, perception of that object.
Okay. And then can you link that idea up to the distinction between philosophy and theology, or specifically what he's saying here about philosophy?
Okay. So let's go back to his earlier definitions. He says philosophy is the possible ontological corrective.
Yeah.
Okay. So philosophy in his definition is concerned with the ontological, being with a capital B, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. This is one of those things that where you have to sit with it. Okay. So yes, you could say intuitively, it's that there is something rather than nothing. If there's nothing, what does it look like? Nobody can define it, because as soon as you define what the nothing is, it becomes something. Okay. Make sense?
Yeah.
So far? Okay.
Yeah.
So then philosophy is to approach from an ontological stance. You're not even questioning, you're not even focusing on the ontic, which also in Heidegger's definition, that theology is dealing with the ontic, not the ontological. because these
Yeah.
are pre-established concepts. And he goes a little bit further in saying that, going back to my walking back example, is that you start with the theological concepts, pre-Christian. Then it becomes Christian. You're applying the Christian wrapper around that. Then philosophy is the wrapper around that, questioning those wrappers themselves. So if you're saying, I believe in God, then philosophy will take that maybe as define your terms. What is the truth claim you're making? And what is this God? Going like with the Paul Tillich example, is that what is the philosophy is questioning what is the Godhead behind the God, existence itself. Okay, all this is a head stretcher. It's not easy to convey this in language, but this is one of those things where you have to sit and think about it. Okay, yeah, why is there something rather than nothing? Type of questions for being.
Right.
And then when he's talking about phenomenology, it is just letting the phenomenon appear. Okay. But particularly important is when he focuses on things like there is no such thing as a Christian philosophy, because that's kind of an oxymoron.
Right.
Yeah, that's the part that I thought I found something that I didn't quite either understand or agree with. It's somewhere in there, but it was when he used the word object. So
Right.
maybe what I'm gonna do just for a second, if it's not a rude proposition, I might just mute and unplug my ears for a second and reread that paragraph. If
Okay.
you guys want to just have your own little moment for a second, because I'm hoping I can recapture what caught my eye there. 1 second. That's all.
Sure. Andrew, when's your hard stop? In a few minutes?
Actually, I kind of need to stop right now, to be honest. Sorry guys. I have to be somewhere in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, so how about we do this? Let's go ahead and make a hard stop. And we're ending with Shane being utterly confused that he has to take this offline.
Yeah. And we can do another talk, like even sometime probably next week if you guys want to, or the week after that, because I do have a little bit more notes on this essay, and we could get into Nietzsche's God is Dead too if you want to.
Sure. Let's go ahead and close this. I think we've covered as much as we can. We'll take what we learned from this and your notes, and we will use that as the springboard into the longer essay, God is Dead.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So that's all I got to say.
All right. I'll just say all this stuff I like to say at the end of my videos, and then you guys can give any last words or plugs. So thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you found this as interesting as we did, and you were and Tim was as helpful in explaining Heidegger as he was to me and Shane. And I hope you guys are looking forward to our next conversation about Heidegger and getting into Nietzsche and the term God is Dead too. And like I always say, thanks so much to everyone who watches this and likes and shares the video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that, and it means a lot to me. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And always remember this: the funk cures all. Alright, everyone, keep having mindgasms. And you guys got any last words or plugs there?
Try not to be utterly confused.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I got.
Any last words, Shane?
No, it's almost like a sentence got deleted there.
Oh, okay.
I swear I heard a sentence and I couldn't find it. I can't find it again.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, let's arrange another day, like next week if you guys want to, or the week after that too would work too, and we can do another discussion about this.
Sure, works for me.
All right.
Yeah, that another essay. Now that I understand the format we were going to go through, I'll definitely spend an hour or two reading up and thinking it beforehand. It'll be a lot more constructive, I think, and do it that way.
If you want to take notes based on this essay that we've already gone through, like based on your improved understanding from Tim explaining things, we can go through that too if we have time.
You were all gobbledygook for most of that, at least from my end.
Oh, were you? I was just saying that if you want to take notes on this essay that we've gone through already, bearing in mind Tim helping explain some of it, we can do that too.
Yeah, I'll probably reread this one as well. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So yeah. All right. Thanks everyone so much for watching, and adios until next time.